All right, guys, so there's going to be multiple parts coming up in relation to this video. So I'll try to keep this somewhat short and just kind of give you a general idea of what we're trying to do here. And then we'll just kind of add to these builds as we go along. So what we're talking about are axle upgrades for your flat fenders, your CJs, anything up until, you know, the end of the run of the CJ in 1986. So one of the weak points of a Jeep, obviously, is its axles. From 1941 up through about 1970, you know, you're running a Dana 25 or a Dana 27 in the front. You're running a Dana or a Spicer 23-2 and the early military flat fenders, and then you're running a Dana 41 or a Dana 44, but again, you're running something with coarse spline axle shafts. It was a two-piece axle design and just really weak axle tubes. So in 71, Jeep came out with offset flange 44 30 spline rear axle. And it was great, especially for the guys running your Dana 18s, and you know, you needed that offset rear. Unfortunately, because they only ran it really 1 year, it's super rare. They're really hard to come by, and they're really expensive. And then 1972 comes along. Not only do they switch the rear out again, but this time they switch out the front. So you get a front Dana 30 open knuckle, which was a huge upgrade from the 25s and 27s. And then the rear, you get to this guy, which is your centered rear Dana 44 30 spline flanged axles. In my opinion, probably the best rear end they ever put in a Jeep CJ or flat fender or anything. But one of the big issues of these is they're just getting really hard to find. You know, if you can find these axles now for less than $500, you probably should buy it, just because they're just that difficult to find. So you go into 1976 then, what does Jeep do? They put, in my opinion, one of the worst rear ends in a Jeep, that AMC 20. So you got a couple, there's like 3 different AMC 20s. You have the offset AMC 20, for the quadra-track Jeeps, then you have the narrow-track AMC 20s, and then you have the wide-track AMC 20 right in that 81, 82 range. So with all these axles we're looking at right here, if you were running the AMC 20 and you don't like it, which I don't blame you, I don't either, your best option was to try and find one of these, or 72, 73 Commandos had them. Spring perches were a little wider on the Commandos than they are on the CJs, but your, you know, best bet was to find one of these 44s, move the perches, you know, make sure the gear ratio is right for what you want, and slap that in there, and you had a big upgrade. Now that worked great for your narrow track stuff, you know, anything 50.5 inches wide, wheel mounting surface. But what were you doing, you know, with the wide track stuff? Now, the wide track, you're right around, I think it's 54.5 inches. You know, your front's right around, I think, 56 inches wide. But one option I have found is this guy. So this is out of International. I want to say this is really early 70s International. When you measure these out, it's right at 56-inch wheel mounting surface. And this is a great option if you can find it for a CJ7 wide track. But again, I've seen about 3 of these in my life. I've got 2 of them right now. This one, and I've got another one that's going to go in my father-in-law's Jeep. And they're just really rare and hard to come by. So when we're dealing with wanting to swap axles and how can we upgrade what's available, what are your options? Well, this is what I've come up with. So you got this rear end right here is a full float Dana 60 out of a Dodge. And this one over here has already been built by me. This was also a full float Dana 60 out of a Dodge. And when my buddy brought this to me, he said, hey, let's just try to do this simple. Let's use the axle shafts from the 44 and see if they'll, you know, what width do we get to if we put them in a 60? Obviously, 30 spline Dana 60, 30 spline Dana 44, it's the same, you know, dimensionally, the side gear is the same. So we bought these housing ends from Dutchman Motorsports. These are drilled to a Ford or international bolt pattern using the set 10 bearing. And the nice thing about this, any Ford 9-inch disc brake conversion kit will work on it. And I did use my alignment bar to set them up. I do recommend that because dimensionally your step here is a little bit larger than your step here. But this is what we've come up with to swap a rear end into your narrow track CJ. This comes out right at 51 inches wide, so it's about a 1/2 inch wider than your 44. But the great thing about this is you get the ability to upgrade to, say, 35 spline, you know, 1.5 inch, 35 spline axle shafts. Your ring and pinion obviously is bigger. You know, the housing itself is way stronger. These are 3 1/8 inch tubes, I believe, that are 5/16 wall. So really, really thick, really, really sturdy. I mean, these things are in 3/4 ton, 1 ton trucks. And, I mean, they're obviously going to be plenty strong enough for a Jeep. And what we're doing here with this one is this is going to be a wide track version. So what I'm going to try and do is it's going to be a little bit wider than your stock wide track rear, but I'm going to try and match this 44 and using the same housing ends as I used on the other one. And we'll get into more depth as we build this, but if you're going to get into building these rear axles, I recommend buying these from Dutchman Motorsports. These are called dog bones. This is the Dana 61. I've got one for doing a Dana 44 as well. But it just gives you, right there is the end of your splines. The flat vertical part, that's your splines. And then that's your pinion if you're really, really focused on, I want the pinion right dead in the center. That's how you do that. So we've already laid out our marks on this. Right there and right there. And what we're just trying to do is I want to match this Scout rear end pretty much exactly. This is going to be getting a Yukon zip locker. When my customer, he bought this axle and that axle. This already had the zip locker in it. I'm going to move the gears around a little bit more. The guy who set the gears up prior, he didn't get the pinion depth quite right, so I got to bring the pinion up a little bit. But yeah, 35 spline zip locker with 35 spline chromoly. We stay 5 on 5.5 bolt pattern. And in these builds, what I'm trying to get across to you guys is you don't necessarily have to put full width axles under these Jeeps anymore. You can build these things with a little bit of, you know, a little bit of tooling, a little bit of skills. You can build these things to stock width without it being, without losing any of the strength. The strength you're gaining in going to something like this as opposed to your 44 or your AMC 20 is immense. And then, well, the other reason we're kind of building this to a certain width is the front end. So the front end he brought me is a 74 to 79 Wagoneer style 44. This is the later version, probably 78 or 9, just because of the axle tube diameter. It's got 3-inch tubes on it. A really easy way to measure these things if you're going to cut them down, especially if you're doing leaf springs, is taking your center pin to center pin measurement on your pads in stock form, which on your Wagoneers is going to be 32 inches. We're putting this in a CJ. It's going to be 27.5. You just go, okay, we're going to move this over 4.5 inches, which means, okay, what happens if we cut this down 4.5 inches? Well, what happens when you cut that down 4.5 inches is we take this measurement, and this is going to be kind of a critical thing, and I think this is actually going to be this is going to make doing housings this much easier. So if we take this outside to outside upper inner seam measurement, we're right at about 49 3/4. So if we took 49 3/4 and you subtract your 4 1/2, you get 45 1/4. Well, what good is that measurement? Well, the good thing about that measurement is I've come up with a way to get your wheel mounting surface measurement without with having the whole front axle disassembled. So here's your different combinations that you're going to find. So obviously, if you're doing CJ outer stuff, you're going to be looking down here. If you're going to start with a Wagoneer front, you're going to be looking at this top line. And this measurement, as you can kind of see it there, is from the outer edge of the top of the inner C to the hub flange. So the wheel mounting surface of the wheel hub. And how I did this was just had a steering knuckle on here, put a spindle on it with all the different combinations. So we got big bearing Chevy spindle with 6 lug, big bearing Chevy spindle with 8 lug, small bearing Chevy spindle with 5 lug, which is probably the most common thing you're going to want to do. That's running the small bearing Chevy spindle with a 1/2 ton Ford rotor. And then obviously you can compare it to your CJ drum brake spindle, your CJ disc brake spindle with 5 lug hubs. And that gives you your dimension from the outside of the top of the inner C to your wheel mounting surface. And now you can compare it to, and this is per side, so you're going to have to multiply this dimension by 2. So if we're looking at this and we measured the outside, okay, if we do cut it down that 4 1/2, we're going to be right at 45 1/4. Well, if we take our 45 1/4, we add 12, because this is the combination, small bearing Chevy spindle with 5 lug. Well, you get 47 1/4. So this front axle, if we just cut it down 4 1/2, is going to be 47 1/4 wheel mounting surface to wheel mounting surface. We're going to build the rear to right about 56 inches wide, which I do like running the front a little bit wider than the rear. I think it just works a little bit better, tracks a little bit better. But that, to me, is a very inexpensive setup if you can find these parts. We're using these 60s now in the rear, mainly because dimensionally, when you measure these out, they're not that much bigger fitting in the back of your Jeep than the Dana 44s or the EMC 20s. And I'll get more in depth when we're building this out. But I really think those 60s are going to become kind of a go-to solution, because those 44s are getting really hard to find. I don't think it's really worth putting money into the AMC 20 stuff. And the cost of actually building something like this, if you're having it built for you, obviously it's not going to be the cheapest thing. But if you can do this yourself, you can probably pick up one of these full float housings for, less than $250. These housing ends, brand new from Dutchman, are $170, I think, shipped to your door. And Dutchman doesn't sponsor me or anything like that, so I'm not just saying their name for no reason. They just make really good parts that you can use for these builds. And if you're going to build an axle out anyway, and I've seen guys that are stuffing chromoly in their Dana 44s and all that stuff, and that's totally fine. But if you're having issues finding an axles to swap into your Jeep, why not do something like that, or do something like this to get something immensely stronger? And the cost of doing so isn't that much worse than building what you already have. So we're gonna do more in-depth parts on building this rear, building the front, how we go about doing that. But hopefully that gives you guys a good idea and some good options for building out your own axles for your Jeep. And again, this does work for a lot of other vehicles as well. I've measured out these 60s, and if you were to come right out to this weld and cut the tube right at that weld while using these housing ends, you can build a semi-float rear axle for right around, you can build it right out to about 64, 65 inch wheel mounting surface. Now this is a Dodge, so there's different full float 60s out there. So take your measurements, see what'll work for you. But if you're doing something like that, I do highly recommend using these. This will be the third one I've done, and I think they just work really, really well. And hopefully you guys will be able to get some of these projects going yourself, or feel free to shoot me an email and we can kind of figure out building a set of axles for what you got going on. So thank you all to my subscribers. If you haven't already, hit the like button, subscribe, throw a comment down below, and we'll catch you on the next one.